I have been here in the US since 1985. So that means for 35 years. I have lived here longer than I have lived in India. Um, and so this has become my what we call karma bhumi, where my work has happened as an adult, as a graduate student. I came here as a graduate student, and so I've had the opportunity of watching life around me since the mid 1980s. Okay, but then the life or the times that I came here, 1985, is very, very different from the present. So to kind of limit it to the United States is in a way kind of constraining, actually, about what I'm going to be talking today, because I think this can be, this can very much apply to people, to Hindus around the world. So the first thing that I want to kind of make a distinction about, because when we talk about Hindus, uh, uh, the difference between my identity as an individual and my identity as a member of the Hindu community. So I think that separation is both important, and then I hope to make the connection between the individual and the group, because the individual cannot really escape group identity. So in terms of the individual, as psychologists would say, it is the most important kind of defining features of the individual is the personality and her attitude, his attitude towards life. And then layered on that is our background, our education background, our class background. Whether I remember when I came here in 1985, I was an kind of a non-traditional student, in the sense that I had already worked in India for about 7 years. I had been a bank officer, I had been a school teacher, and I had worked as a copy editor for the Hindu for a year. But when I came here as a poor graduate student, and this, believe it or not, I lived on about $150 to $200 a month for the first 2 years. Whereas I could see younger students coming in, people, at those times, very little money was allowed by the Reserve Bank in terms of how much you could bring here. But many of these people, many of my fellow students who came, had family here. They had much more wealthy parents back home. And so just in terms of that kind of divide, the confidence that money gives. Okay, class and education, can shape the individual's response to society and one's life experience, the good and the bad, and all of those kinds of things. And so it is very important. And here I mention this because, someone will say, a Sundar Pichai or Satya Nadella could be a Hindu, and their individual identities are so different, and they can kind of somehow transcend that kind of group identity, but really not. Because a Satya Nadella or a Sundar Pichai may face tomorrow, as they're maybe facing today, some accusation, that there is caste discrimination in Microsoft or Google or whatever. So that kind of intersection is going to happen, unless, of course, one is so removed. And again, I will bring that issue later on in terms of the kind of identity that we seek. How much of what we grew up with we want to efface, to kind of wipe out. Okay, there are quite a few, or I would say, I will have to be careful. There are people who have come here who don't want to do anything with their Hindu identity, and they submerge that identity, either because they have married a person from a different group, or they have, for whatever reasons, political or emotional or spiritual, whatever reasons, they may have changed. Hey, a Bobby Jindal or a Nikki Haley, as they convert to becoming a Christian or Muslim or whatever, those things can also affect in how we kind of consider ourselves as Hindu. And then Hindus as a group, again, for those of us who do this in sociology, psychology, and communication, there are two kinds of, identity. One which we kind of claim for ourselves, what we call avowed. That is, what I think of myself. This is who I think of myself as a Hindu, and this is what I think of the Hindu community. And then there is the ascribed identity, and that is how others characterize us. And that is something which, today I hope we can talk about, because that ascription, there are so many facets to it: the positive, the neutral, and the negative getting more and more shrill, more and more organized, more and more strategically targeted, that we need to pay attention to that. Uh, I believe later today, and this is an interesting coincidence, there are about 5 students, second generation Hindu American students, who are going to talk about identity, about how growing up in the United States, as going to school as a kindergartner, as a middle school student, as a high school student, now as college students, or as young adults, how their identity has shaped or morphed or has been challenged. And here again, I think, I hope they will also kind of talk about these things, because the individual kind of experiences that they have gone through here in the US, which is very, different from what their parents went through as they came here as, students, or as after, the 1990s, coming here as a, high tech, worker. Those experiences are very different from growing up. So I have a son who was born here, and who is now in college. And what he says about himself and about his identity is kind of very interesting for me to observe as a professor of communication studies, as someone who has studied, quote unquote, or been trained as a social scientist. Okay. So in terms of our personality, we all know that these are the kind of big 5 we can think of in terms of our dimensions: our extroversion or introversion, how sociable we are. And in my intercultural communication book, we talk about how some people kind of get acculturated to a new community. So we talk about culture shock, for example. And in our book we talk about this, because in India itself, I remember the first time that when I traveled, I had not traveled beyond Karnataka. When I first went to Mumbai in 1969, I believe, I was so shocked. My brothers and my sisters were, completely kind of, you know, our sense of who we are and where we were was completely shaken. Just traveling in the kind of commuter trains in Mumbai for us was something, a different world experience. That was culture shock. And that, especially when we travel abroad, when we settle abroad, these extroversion, introversion aspects of our personality are very important in how quickly we get acculturated, how effectively we get acculturated, all of those kinds of things. The other dimension is our agreeableness. Here again, our level of friendliness. Because we come in that whole range, and extremely important for us to understand that individual experiences in terms of identity, and how we accept it, acknowledge it, embrace it, or distance ourselves from it, are based on these dimensions. Okay. The third dimension is what we call conscientiousness. How conscientious we are in terms of our discipline. Little, so what we would in Indian terms, Sanskrit terms, called Shraddha, our attention and discipline, okay, towards life, towards all that which we do. Um, and here again, Indians have, in general, acquired a particular kind of a public profile. So every year, the Pew Foundation comes up with, these kinds of profiles about different ethnic groups and religious groups and so on. And again, these things can be looked at in detail, but I just want to mention how they also affect our identity. Then our emotional stability. Okay. Um, we Hindus are very accepting in so many ways, but we can also be very prickly. And people from my generation, where we kind of grew up in a subsistence economy in India, we still have a level of concern about our economic well-being, about our place in the world, because we had very little. And so sometimes my son teases, why do you collect all of these kinds of things? Throw it away, Dad. And I tell him, look, we live differently. And you know what? Maybe now we are at a time where we have to begin to save. We have to begin to we have to be concerned about the kind of environment, those kinds of things. But in terms of emotional stability, how thoughtfully, carefully, responsibly we respond to people. And here again, all our gurus, all our good teachers, what do they say? It is that kind of get to that level of sthita prajna. Okay, that is important. But we talk a lot. But I have understood that in our community, that emotional stability is sometimes difficult, because here again, my next slides, I will take you through those things. And finally, in terms of our personality dimension, our intellect, our level, not merely of education, but our creativity, our curiosity. I have some wonderful musician friends here. I teach at a school, a regional college, university, but our school of music is one of the top in Southeast United States. And I recently went to one of my colleagues' homes, and this is a man who has spent his life playing the violin. He's about my age, and he's world renowned violinist. And it is so the kind of level of creativity that we can talk about. um, and again, I know in among uh, the audience today, I have a good friend who is an aerospace engineer, who has spent his life working on things that even on the surface we will have difficulty figuring out. But that's what we mean by intellect. Okay, so those are the kinds of individual personal identity issues. Okay, and finally, very quickly, our attitudes, how we respond to people and situations. And this, I know, especially when we feel threatened, and I think the Hindu groups and the Hindu identity has been threatened, much more so now, simply because of the age of the social media that we live in, and all of those kinds of issues, and about certain kinds of political developments in India and so on. But our attitudes towards life, negative, positive, or neutral, stems from what we have learned, what our experiences are, what our beliefs and value systems are, and how then this our attitudes get displayed in terms of our actions. Okay, and this again, I think, extremely important when we consider ourselves as Hindus, as a group, and how if we are aware of these things, if we train our children, if we train ourselves to have that kind of positive attitude, to kind of focus on the kinds of things that we take pride in, our intellectual kind of openness and all of those kinds of things, then those threats can also be minimized. Okay, um, and I'm going to kind of skip over this, but for those people who are interested in psychology and social psychology, and this is something that I talk about also to groups of young people, um, simply because in terms of how so many of our of our children who seem to distance themselves from their Hindu identity, it is because of these aspects: a self-concept. Who am I? What others think of me? How do I compare myself with a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew? Um, and what are my assumptions about who I am as a Hindu, about what Hinduism is all about? These are aspects that then can translate into spillover into our group identity. And I keep confronting this, when I go to the local temple, when I talk to people, when I have these kinds of, exchanges, uh, across, different groups and in these kinds of settings. So what is the Hindu identity in the United States? And I know, I mean, books have been written. I have written articles, detailed articles on these aspects. So, what I have chosen to highlight here today is not so the summum bonum. It's not the sum of all of these things. Uh, but I just want to kind of highlight a few things so that we kind of have some kind of markers, some milestones about the Hindu presence in the United States, and how it has gotten changed or been influenced across a couple of centuries now. Okay, so we are a very small group. We are just about 0.7 to 0.8% of the population. I think the US population is now about 350 million. So we are we are about 3 million people. But that of the 3 million Indian Americans, only 53% are Hindu. So that is kind of interesting too. What is interesting is among the Indian American groups, 18% of Indian Americans are Christian. So there's, it's interesting to even look at the immigration patterns and who has been offered the kind of, domicile and immigration status easily into the United States. That's a whole different area. But here, that's what numbers say. And of course, we all know that Swami Vivekananda, when he came in 1893 and addressed the World Parliament of Religions, was one of the first Hindus to actually bring to the general public here the idea about Hinduism. Even though before him, of course, Emerson and Thoreau and others who had begun reading Hindu texts, Thoreau, who mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, they had begun to kind of get an idea. But for them to actually find a Hindu come and address Vivekananda, surely his talk, and then his uh, starting of the American Vedanta Society in 1894 is also an important historical marker. And and I'm kind of, uh, I just want to mention that in terms of the Indian American presence, some people have gone as far back as into the uh, uh, 17th and 18th centuries, that maybe a few people were brought in, by the British from India. But we are, and then of course the Sikhs came in the late 19th century, settled in California, Oregon, Washington, those western states of the United States. But we are talking about the Hindu presence, and um, Paramahamsa Yogananda and his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, were very big influences. And Yogananda, and this is something that we tend to forget, was a huge presence. He lived here 32 years, and the book really is one of the classics that has sold in the literally maybe hundreds of millions. Um, and and um, and of course, later on in the 1960s and 70s, the popularities of gurus and swamis, and the big, the Beatles embracing this, and all of the kinds of changes that happened in the United States in the 1960s, the civil rights movement and the women's empowerment, um, and music. So it brought together people like young people who were interested in change and in trying to figure out uh, their sense of the world. So Maharshi Mahesh Yogi, Shivananda, various others, and of course Swami Prabhupada, and the ISKCON movement. Those are big changes that happened. So here's a quick timeline. So 1960s and 70s, we had the Immigration Act, which brought a lot, number of people to the U.S., mostly doctors and engineers and scientists. If you think about the 1970s, we also had Idi Amin expelled Indians, most of them Hindus, basically, from Uganda. And many not only sought asylum and went to the United Kingdom, but many came to the US. And so there was this big joke in the 1980s, starting in the 1980s, about hotels, motels, and potels, because most of those motels and hotels were owned by the Patels. And so the Hindu presence in the service industry, began to be acknowledged, because previously it was, more of the kind of, medicine, engineering, business, science, technology people. Okay. In the 1970s, the first Hindu temples were built. Um, Here again, 1966, importantly, ISKCON was founded. And I still remember when I, as a graduate student, I don't know, maybe New York City, walking into the airport, either at JFK or Newark, and finding one of these Hare Krishna people, white young man, and a young woman with him, trying to sell me a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. And I told them, look, I come from India. I know something about this, but they were known to pester people. So in fact, you know, they did both good, and they had a lot of negative, the kind of pushback from people who felt they were being harassed by the by the Hare Krishnas, whether on a street in in New York City, or at airports or train stations and so on. And then in the 1990s, we began to see this whole software, high tech immigrants, people coming in, and then of course the whole Y2K, the year 2000 computer challenge brought literally tens of thousands, if not more, Indian, engineers and techies, as we call them now, to the US. Okay, so that was a quick timeline. The Hindu is an unique animal compared to, I mean, even a Jain or a Buddhist. Forget about a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh, whose identities are very clear. There are clear demarcations. They are simple, and the story that they tell is, we may say simplistic, but it's easy. It can be, who you are as a Christian or a Sikh or a Jain can be said in 3 sentences and people get it. But unlike them, when we are asked, so who are you? We are flummoxed, because even in India, no one says I'm a Hindu. We usually identify ourselves with a jati. So I'm from Karnataka, and most people in Karnataka would say, oh, I'm a Gauda, oh, I'm a Lingayat, oh, I'm a this, I'm a that. Very rarely would someone say, I'm a Hindu. And unlike a Sikh or a Christian or a Muslim, we don't have one book. As Jeffrey Armstrong, whose book, whose translation of the Bhagavad Gita I recently reviewed, once, addressing a group, said, oh, Hindus, they are not a people of the book. They're a people of the library. And that kind of stuck in my mind, because, yes, we cannot point out to one book. We are not really of the book in a way, because we don't keep in our puja room one book. Maybe, of course, if you are part of a particular, sampradaya, a particular, you follow a particular guru, maybe you do have a book that you also keep in your puja room. Okay. And then the other thing that makes our Hindu identity a challenge, as well as a strength, is that we speak so many languages. Our regional identities. Here in the US, there are literally thousands of groups. You have Kannada Kuta of Atlanta, Maharashtra Mandal, or Tamil Sangam, and so on and so forth. So that regional and language identities are also something that makes our attempt to define or describe ourselves as Hindus a bit of a challenge. And we have had these kinds of attacks, both in terms of what India has faced through a couple of millennia, and then we have had the kinds of challenges after we got independence about who a Hindu is, and the whole changes in the Hindu personal law, articles 25 through 30. Many of these kinds of things make it a challenge for us to kind of clearly tell someone else about who we are, who I am. Okay. And now we have this thing, especially post independence, that India called itself secular, and then 1970s emergency, we included the term secular, we included the term socialist. And more so, many of these progressive liberal groups or individuals, or those who call themselves progressive or liberal, call themselves South Asian. They don't even call themselves, forget about calling, identifying themselves as Hindus. They don't even call themselves Indian. Okay. And they have formed these groups saying that they represent minorities. And you will have in that list of minorities everyone, including even Christians and Muslims, Indian Muslims, Indian Christians, Jains, Sikhs, others. But there are no Hindus. But the only Hindus that are included in these South Asian and minority groups are those who have basically distanced themselves from the kind of Hindu sampradayas, Hindu ethos. So they have basically kind of, whitewashed themselves into a kind of a secular identity. And those of us who are a Hindu. So if you are a member of the Hindu American Foundation, we are quickly labeled as right wing. We are branded as nationalists or fascists. Strangely enough, these days, and unfortunately, those people who have begun to who began to support Trump and so on, they have been grouped together with white nationalists. So the only two bad guys, it seems, in the United States these days are the Hindu nationalists and the white nationalists. Okay. I'm addressing mostly Hindus here in the United States. As to, when someone says who is a Hindu, and there's this kind of thing, people say, oh, Hinduism is a way of life. What does that mean? It seems to be a very kind of an abstract and a vague response that can mean anything. But Dr. Radhakrishnan, as once said, Hinduism enjoins a strict code of practice while allowing absolute liberty in the world of thought. So we do have certain kinds of do's and don'ts, the yamas and niyamas that make us Hindu. Okay. Whether it is the kind of worshipping of deities, our puja rooms, our food habits, way of dealing with elders and teachers, our value system. There are many of these aspects that are fairly strictly kind of defined, again, based on our jatis, our sampradayas. So yes, it's a way of life, but then there are clear markers for each one of us, because it's a familial part of the family tradition, part of the jati tradition, part of the sampradaya traditions. Okay. So and we have this thing, and here an article by Nitin recently, the idea of panchakosha, the 5 layers or the 5 aspects or the 5 constituents of an individual. What are they? The Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, and Anandamaya Kosha. These are like what we also say in some of the social sciences when we talk about how we form relationships. Initially, it is at the kind of outer level, and over time and through conversations, we get deeper and deeper. And similarly, we can see this as this kind of, looking at almost like the earth, the outer plates and the inner, core and all of those things. So our physical body is someone who identifies only it's a nominal Hindu. That's what Nitin says. But for those of us, many of us, who may be aware of the identity in terms of all of the kinds of social and political kinds of issues, we are politically aware, but maybe we are not paying attention to the kinds of philosophical, cultural, traditional aspects. And so, for example, when I go to my local temple here, and while the rituals, the pujari is good and so on, if I talk to my friends and I say, what are the Shad Darshanas? you know, it's a rare person who would be able to list me the 6 major schools of philosophy and why that is important. And when it comes to Vedanta, and or for example, just this idea about Dvaita, Advaita, Vishishta Advaita, and so on, people really don't have much knowledge about these things. They do certain kinds of things, they follow practices at home, but they are not aware. So as someone who is a Dvaita myself, I say, let me explain to you what this means. And that level of knowledge, unfortunately for us, so many Hindus have disregarded that. So the next level is Manomaya Kosha, the mind, the cultural Hindu who is aware of these cultural aspects, who reads, about Hinduism who can make distinctions about this, not to quarrel, but to understand. Um, and then going on to another deeper level, someone who is both who is not only aware, but who is a practicing Hindu. So this practicing Hindu might be a consciously aware vegetarian, a consciously aware practitioner of meditation, a consciously aware follower of a guru, someone who is a sadhaka, a seeker. Okay. And finally, the Anandamaya Kosha, people who have, uh, practiced for long. And I know I have good friends here, white Hindu friends who have been doing meditation since the 1960s, who were students, started, through a rare accident in their life that they came across. And when I meet them, I feel, honestly speaking, ashamed, because no, I don't meditate as much and as regularly and as in a disciplined fashion as I see my wonderful good white Hindu friend. Okay, so these five types are present. uh, that there is an increasing uh, level of attacks against Hindus and Hinduism, both. Okay, Hinduism, and the attack is mostly based on this idea of caste and jati. And I just finished writing a long chapter on jati for my intercultural communication book, the second edition that my co-author and I are working on. Uh, to point out how complex and complicated the issue of jati and varna are. And this is where I think so many of us get stuck, because either we tend to rationalize or gloss over the real discrimination on the ground and experience of terrible inequality and inequity and even violence in India, and then to embrace the transcendental, the beautiful, the aesthetically pleasing, the intellectually rigorous, the emotionally satisfying aspects of Hinduism. How do we reconcile the two and be able to explain that? And unless one is informed, we can't do that. And therefore, the attacks, and the people who have been attacking Hindus have been doing this for a long, long time. Okay. But now it has become much more sharpened, and many American universities, many Western universities have now academics who basically have made their life and who have become multimillionaires, millionaires and multimillionaires, basically you know riding this particular jati ship. Okay, and the latest book, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which has sold in the millions, has made her a few millions already. Okay, so it's a kind of a civilizational battle that we are confronting right now, and therefore we are now at this cusp. Especially, again, for me, it's easy, when my son says, "Oh, I'm an atheist," I say, "Yeah, fine, you are still a Hindu," simply because we deal with all of these kinds of issues. Let me walk you through Sankhya, or or any of the Shad Darshanas, for example. You know, and that if that kind of a conversation one can have with one's children, then there is really, the struggle becomes, there is no struggle. It becomes, from an argument, it becomes a conversation. And I keep reminding my son, let's have a conversation. I don't want arguments, because arguments means there is kind of an opposition. Whereas in a conversation, we learn together. I've forgotten some things about Sankhya, but here, let's sit down, take a look at this. what then do we, understand here about these matters? So what have we been doing? What can be done in terms of countering the many attacks in the media, in academia, in terms of political activism, in terms of social activism? Because there are a number of forces who have made Hindus their primary target next to white nationalists. They will call them white nationalists. They won't say white Christian nationalists. They will not talk about Muslim nationalism or Sikh nationalism, nothing. It's always Hindu nationalists. And so we Hindus have been kind of lagging behind many other groups. The Sikh groups, for example, are much, much more powerful. For example, half the cabinet of Justin Trudeau is Sikh in Canada. Uh, and the Sikh presence here in the United States, which, every state you go, and especially the Western states, are highly influential. But what have the Hindus been doing? Because we have been kind of, we are like cats. We are difficult to herd us together. Or if we get together in a group, we end up shooting each other because, we are a tradition of differences. However, we have these organizations, and I have worked with about 3 or 4 of these here that I mentioned. The Hindu American Foundation, that was started in 2003 by a couple of doctors, and one of the doctors' wives, who is a lawyer, good friends. I wrote 8 years of their annual Hindu human rights reports. The Hindu American Foundation is basically a second generation organization. And unfortunately, the first generation and some, Hindu diaspora have also attacked the Hindu American Foundation for this or that, report that they have published. So this is one of the big issues, I think, that we have to kind of resolve amongst ourselves. And this goes back to where I started out with in terms of individual identity and some of the kinds of personality dimensions where the negative personalities end up with, with their negative baggage that they dump on these organizations that make it a challenge to run, to efficiently manage these organizations. There's the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, which is an offshoot of the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, and that baggage really, and I'm not going to talk about it, that is something that they have to deal with. Should they, how closely they identify with the RSS and this Sangha Parivar, what is it that they represent? And unfortunately, sometimes we don't have good spokespersons, articulate people who are able to say, 1, 2, 3, this is who we are, this is why we are this, and this is what is good about us. And whatever you say is bad about us, let us give this 1, 2, 3 response. That kind of clarity and efficiency in our communication campaigns is also not there. There is the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, and there's the same issue there. The Hindu Students Council, which is doing good work. And by the way, this evening that they're going to have 5 young people talk about the same issue that I'm talking about now. There is the Hindu American Political Action Committee, because we have to be politically active, and slowly we are beginning to have representatives. Unfortunately, many of our representatives, so-called Hindu, tend to call themselves progressive and secular, and end up as our Ro Khanna, part of the Pakistan caucus, and challenging the Indian government and so on. But organizations that are doing some really good work on the ground, charitable organizations like Seva International, and I've given the links to these organizations so that you can kind of take a look at what these people are doing. And I just finished collating a report for Seva International, where we say during this year of the pandemic, we brought together about 125 dharmic organizations together with us. We combined our resources, financial, human, material resources to respond to the pandemic wherever we were in different parts of the state, in big cities and small towns. And that is the kind of work I think will get a lot of leverage. And I mentioned Seva International because Seva International is bold enough to say we are a Hindu faith-based organization. They're upfront. Okay, this is who we are. And as I mentioned, there are literally, thousands of these regional language, jati, cultural associations, music, dance, so on, that are primarily Hindu because they're grounding their artistic, spiritual, linguistic, whatever grounding is Hindu. Okay. And then Hindu temples can become centers for bringing people together, not merely, to go beyond the traditional pujas. Okay. How can we help use those temples to kind of share value, the knowledge and practices of Hinduism? And so we, beyond the traditional pujaris and priests, we need to have those experts also sit and be there and present lectures. And, because we have a divide, we have the gurus and the Swamijis there, for example, the Arsha Vidya Gurukula and so on. And then we have the traditional temples. So the kind of, there needs to be some kind of a joining of forces where we can both offer the traditional pujas as well as these kinds of presentations about our art, about our spiritual practices, about our spiritual texts, and so on. Okay. We are a recent new small immigrant group in the US, but we are, one of the oldest tribal groups, if I can say so. And our practices are rich. They need to be preserved. They need to be practiced. They need to be celebrated. But then, we have had this kind of assaults from basically, monopolistic, monotheistic groups. And whether Christian, whether Muslim, or, for example, any proselytizing group. The Sikhs proselytize, even the Baha'is proselytize. I used to go every 3 months to Washington, D.C. when I was teaching in Virginia to attend the Freedom House Religious Freedom Caucus. And they're sitting around the table, about, big table, about 30 people. I was the only one representing the Hindu American Foundation who would say, I'm the only non-proselytizer here. Because everyone is complaining, oh, in this country, they don't allow us to, teach our stuff. It's not about teaching their stuff. It's about converting people. And so it is, we are not monopolists. The whole monotheism stuff I'm not going to get into because there's a big other debate. And we have to deal with this issue of jati and caste. And I think the more open we are and the more clear we are, it is, and again, it is highly complex. There are so many positive aspects of, the jati identity, because these are basically, identities in terms of work, whereas now it has become this whole endogamous thing and so on. But we need to, first of all, inform ourselves. And then hopefully the chapter that I'm including in my book will help, students learn a little bit more, both the good and the bad and the neutral aspects of it. And we need to share the kind of rich and, very vast body of Hindu philosophical literature. It is important. Wherever I have gone, whichever university I have taught in, I have brought in musicians. I have brought in speakers. And unless, we do so, and unfortunately, and I say this openly, so many of my colleagues have failed to. They don't even, want to identify themselves as Hindu on campus. They fail to bring any interesting speaker or a musician or a dancer to campus while they have the opportunity. And this is where I need to, uh, kind of needle my own colleagues, my own friends to do so, because without that, these attacks by, much more powerful forces, endowed, both in terms of money and in terms of their activist background and so on.
And it really resonates with me again, being a potential immigrant in the US. But there were a few things that I learned from your talk, and based on my own experience. First of all, I think a lot of the Indians, especially the first generation immigrants here, are one of the greatest proponents of the anti-Hindu sentiment, and here's why. I mean, most of your Ivy League, quote unquote, left-leaning academics, right? They all come from a JNU type ecosystem, and they are also very much I would say involved in this, because not only do they make their bread and butter by being on think tanks, it is also now impacting foreign policy, which is quite harmful, I would say, in the long run. So I think that's something that's often overlooked. In addition, they also inform the internal narrative within the US if you talk about anti-Hindu sentiment. So that's the first thing. And I think the prime example, as you had rightly mentioned, Ro Khanna, I would also like to bring up the Honorable Pramila Jayapal, who was an Indian citizen till the age of 35, and today is one of the most anti-India, I would say, senators right around. And she's joined a lot of the CAIR and other caucuses that are an antithesis to whatever is pro-India. Also, the thing is that if you want to learn anything about Hinduism, whether you're first generation or second generation, you're likely to learn it from a white person in Arsha Vidya rather than a temple priest who's more well versed with his puja rates than pracharam. And I think the last point that I had is that for people who are second generation, right, Hindu culture is what is shown in Bollywood, which is a very, very distorted narrative. So I feel somewhere there's a complete gap of information, and the Hindu identity itself is gradually being diluted, if not completely eliminated, and it is just restricted to the flair and pomp during customary festivals more than anything else. So I just wanted to get your take on it, and how best that we could tackle this at using a multi-pronged approach.
Very, very pertinent, very cogent points. But I think this is the paradox about being Hindu. Okay, because even that label itself is a misnomer. So there are, we can think of two forces, the kind of centripetal forces and the centrifugal forces in Hinduism. So if we think about people who have understood the nature of India as a space, as now as a nation, and about Hindu identity being spread across regions and languages and sampradayas and so on, and have sought to bring them together. So, for example, the HSS, sorry, for example, the RSS and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, their attempt to bring people on a plank has also been kind of, I mean, while well intentioned, also goes against the kind of traditional way that we as members of jatis and members of sampradayas, followers of gurus and swamis and so on, kind of rebel against, right? This is something, in a way, is really the beauty of being a Hindu. And I think that should be actually celebrated, because what we now have, even the concept of a nation, for example, is, it just goes back about 400 years, the Treaty of Westphalia, I think something like 1638 and so on. Otherwise, the whole modern nation system, historically, it was very, just a new blip over the last 400 years. And the nation system itself has demanded a certain kind of coming together of forces. And we may find, we have already found that it is highly negative force. Nations have quarreled. All the attempts at bringing us together have been problematic. Why? Because that concept of a nation itself has been challenging because it does not make space for diversity. Because as a nation, here in the United States, for example, now we are finding out, because as there's more and more immigrants, more and more diversity, people are saying, oh, what one of the, I forget the name of this suburb of Detroit, where there are more Muslims, and say, oh, we want our namaz calls, 5 times, a day. So, people have begun, or Sikhs who have said, oh, we want our children to carry their swords into the classroom. How do we deal with these things? So where a nation has a kind of a uniform civil code, and there have been all kinds of compromises sought to be made with certain kinds of powerful forces. Finally, as someone said, demography is destiny. So the more people you have, and the representatives, that's why, Pramila Jayapal in Washington State, and Ro Khanna in California, with that kind of voter bloc, they go against Hindus not because that's what they feel, but simply because it's convenient, because the votes are somewhere else. And that, I think, is something that we need to be able to articulate and say, what constitutes real diversity? What happens in a modern nation system? And what, therefore, can we as Hindus who have learned to live side by side, interact, the kinds of transactions that we have among jatis, across non-Hindu jatis, how has that been enabled? What has allowed that? What are those core principles of Hinduism that has enabled us to live side by side? Saying, oh, you are separate, fine, you to yours, we to ours, but let us, transact business. Okay? So that aspect, I think, is something that we need to be, really talking about, articulating, kind of, because we are at that cusp, that, that edge of the cliff now, where nation systems can once again fall over the precipice and have the next world war, or we begin to kind of say, how do we rethink this? What are our guiding principles? Those guiding principles are fundamental Hindu principles.
This is about political activism because, again, leaning into the points that you raised, I do feel that there is a need for Hindus to get more politically active. So even leaders are more cognizant, right, of the collective force. One example I wanted to give you, I don't recollect her name, but there was an African woman African-American congresswoman from Georgia who was, very anti-India. And I do recollect Indians, contributed to her opponent's campaign in record numbers. She's no longer a politician anymore. So I'm just saying those kind of collective forces, if they can be marshaled, I think we would be more respected as a potential voting bloc. And hence a lot of the negative narrative being spewed against Hindus per se would, I think, be checked from that perspective. So I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you see that's happening or needs to happen on that end?
Yeah, for example, the Hindu American Political Action Committee has very bright, talented, well-networked people who understand the need for Hindu Americans to make their presence felt in the political kind of arena, compared to the amount of money, for example, the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, has put in over the past 2 decades, 3 decades, or maybe more, literally hundreds of millions. They have trained young people, media savvy, law savvy. These are the academics, whether you go to Columbia or to Harvard or you go to ACLU or you see, the kind of political activism. These are trained people who have, that pipeline has been built, cared for, and lots of money has been put in so that they have begun to represent the Muslim, issues to Americans. And that is what I think we need, in terms of support to the to HAPAC.
I think we are really proud of people like you who have gone there, where no man has gone before, and really stood for us, and you're still standing for us. I mean, really appreciate that. Just tell me, Dr. Rao, the fact that you and I are speaking on this particular subject today openly on the internet, I think it's a very big step forward. I don't know whether we would have been able to do this, say, 10, 15, 20 years back.
Just in terms of communication technology as well as social media. Here again, we have to weigh the pros and the cons. These are media that can be used for good or bad. And the challenge and the opportunity, therefore, for us is how do we use these media, these communication challenges, these communication technologies. I don't want to restrict this thing, my talk or conversation only to the United States, because we are literally, we are talking across borders. Our life impacts, whatever I say or do now impacts the same moment around the world. But the challenge for us, therefore, is also how much of this to use, because I know, young people and, people my age really succumbing to the seductions of technology and to social media, who spend most of their life surrounded by, impacted by, influenced by this. So how do we also therefore bring that kind of balance? If these technologies can be used, can be leveraged to have conversations, to share information, to do good, that is going to be wonderful. This is a challenge that humanity faces. It is not just one group.
I just wanted some explanations from you about some empirical observations that I seem to have made, whether these are trends or not. Because the first thing I find among Hindus is that even if they are practicing Hindus in the sense of having a daily ritual schedule and everything, they do not wish to identify in a social sense as Hindus. This is one thing, especially in the United States, that I think is a trend. Secondly, the Hindus in the United States also seem to be very comfortable identifying with their linguistic identity and even with the brown identity and, of course, with the South Asian identity. But somehow the Hindu repels them. So what do you think are the underlying structural or social or other reasons for all these things? I mean, and first of all, are these observations really true?
We have to be careful about generalizations. And I tell this to my students every time I walk into the classroom, because we in the social sciences are especially conscious about what kind of evidence we gather to make a point. And I tell my students, we never prove a point in social sciences. We only offer evidence in support or against. That's about it. But I think your observations are valid. I have seen that over the past 35 years, that, there is a kind of diffidence at one level. But again, it's generational differences too, because those of us who came in the 60s and 70s and 80s are different from those who came in the 90s and then later on, about who we are. And then I think, one of the issues that other people have written about is our own, colonial background and what made us kind of feel less than ourselves. How our identities were kind of stolen, robbed, and how was reshaped. and I think we are still kind of in that struggle to kind of figure out who we are, you know, and that is not an easy job. That is not an easy task. I think Hindus in India have an issue unless, you know, you kind of, you you're stuck in, or you stay in your own village or small town and don't travel, have this kind of diffidence about who, what we represent. And again, I think the big challenge, as I mentioned, is that seeking of the Hindu identities, the big baggage that we carry is jati. You may, I mean, people proclaim loudly about their Muslim identity. Damned if they, if we say something about, the Twin Towers and the, Pentagon and then the Mary Terrorist Act. Hey, completely different. Hey, that's whatever. Individual Muslims, whatever. Even though, Islam as a religious ideology or as a religious, faith propounds certain kinds of things, Muslims are proud about their Islamic faith. Christians have a bloody history, but it doesn't matter. But we Hindus somehow, with our, and this is all about the modern, especially the modern idea about equality, okay, and which comes from this idea of nation, where everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. And there are some interesting wheels here that needs to be kind of fit so that we can begin to explore those kinds of connections. Whereas Hinduism is seen as a hierarchical tradition. We believe in hierarchy. Hey, I'm a Madhva. We talk about Bheda. Madhvacharya talked about 5 layers of difference. Okay, highly logical, but then in a nation system where we talk about equality, we somehow both look for equality, not just in the eyes of the law, but kind of equal outcomes, equal, all those things, completely forgetting that, we have inequality in every society, acknowledged or unacknowledged. So that is, but then these things need to be articulated, and not everyone has the training or has the talent or has the skill or has the information to be able to articulate. And this is where I think organizations like the Hindu American Foundation or Seva International or HSS or the Hindu Students Council need to train spokespersons. I keep mentioning about communication because all the good work that we do could vanish within a second, within a minute, if we misspeak, in some way or the other about our Hindu beliefs or our Hindu values or our Hindu practices. And so that training, and give it to the Sikhs, to the Christians, to the Muslims. They have wonderful spokespersons. They're all over the place, from Hollywood to Harvard. They're there. We seem to take pride in our, Silicon Valley stuff, our Sundar Pichais and Satya Nadellas, and billionaire, venture capitalists and so on. But none of them are able to or willing to come forward and talk about their Hindu identity. So it is not just the ordinary person who even avoids the gaze in public with a fellow Hindu, but when our billionaires cannot talk about it, there is a challenge here. Sure, I think you're correctly identified, but I think it is it's an opportunity for us to kind of identify the people who can articulate and also train people. We need to train people.
Do you think Dr. Conrad L's book, Who is a Hindu, is going to be a key resource in this kind of debate?
Yeah, of course, that book, that's 20 years old now. It's still valid. I don't take back anything that is in there. But let's say that the problem has evolved somewhat and has become more pressing. Meanwhile, the Veerasaivas have been taken out of Hinduism. The Jains themselves already had an in-between status, but they insisted on being recognized as a non-Hindu minority, mainly to save their schools. Then just recently, the Sarna, the tribal religions in Jharkhand, they also had an in-between status. They have now definitely been severed from Hinduism. So this is just continually going on. And I wonder if Hinduism is even a majority anymore. So, you can look at this strategically and saying, yeah, but this also has advantages. I don't see them immediately, but all right. Nevertheless, the fact that constantly people are being encouraged to take their distance from Hinduism, you can't see that as a positive development. Because with that, it's not only an institutional thing in order to safeguard their school system or something, it also eats into the mentalities. They have to start defending the point that they are not Hindus. And so they try to sum up everything they can find negative about Hinduism. And if they weren't anti-Hindu to begin with, they become anti-Hindu. So, the situation is just serious. And so I hope I've contributed to an understanding of what the situation is. On the good side, I have to mention that there is a lot of Hindu intellectual churning nowadays. There are many platforms now, thanks to the internet that made all this possible at a very cheap price. But, that's interesting. It's nice to read all those articles that are being produced on Swaraj magazine, the debates on the Jaipur dialogues, and so on and so on. But so far, it's a necessary step before you can do something, but that necessary next step is just not materializing. Now, exactly when you have a majority in parliament that you can hardly dream of ever getting again. This is the time to take all this intellectual churning and turn it into action, turn it into constitutional reform, for instance. And so that is not happening at the moment. And okay, you see, normally you could say, well, after this churning, it takes some time before this is translated into policy. But I'm afraid that you don't have that time. You see, that there is a certain urgency. So let me take the opportunity of urging all of those among you who have any say with anybody in government that you have to really motivate them to get serious about the Hindu image that they have used to garner votes and to get the majority that they currently enjoy. And so at the moment, you see, that's a real problem. If Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, the ultimate founder of the BJP, came back, he would be terribly disappointed. Now, some people say, oh, we need to found a new party. You see, that's very impractical. And again, that's something that takes time which you don't have. So the most practical thing is to somehow remind the BJP of the reason why their party ever started and motivate them to do important pro-Hindu things, especially the reform of the constitutional articles 25 to 30 is relatively easy to do. It doesn't hurt the majority. It doesn't provoke opposition from the minorities. It's not a violent thing. It's not difficult. You just have to do it. And so that's what is missing. After they could do a difficult thing like Kashmir, like the CAA, this job is easy. And it is far more important for Hindus than the reintegration of Kashmir, although it's good. I stand behind it. Nevertheless, it is much less important than to free Hinduism from the shackles that keep it back at the moment. You need to restore Hindu autonomy in education and over temples. These are the two most urgent things. The rest can follow later. Thank you.
Why is the government of India, this follows on what Conrad was saying, we out here, and just let me remind you, Rameshji, whenever you say Swami Vivekananda, remember before him in 1838, we Hindus came to Guyana first. So we are really among the first Hindu in the West, if not the first, as a group, certainly as a group. We are battered all the time with this Hindu identity, as you have rightly said. I'm both American and Trinidadian. I find America far more conducive to asserting your Hindu identity than we have had to struggle with our racial problems out here in the Caribbean. We've had a second migration of Guyanese Hindus to New York. And very rarely when we speak about Indian and Hindu, we forget the Caribbean Hindus. We really need to integrate them more in, because our experience should give pointers to where our children in America are going to go. Though there is the difference in class. We were poor, and I find we kept our culture far stronger than the upper elite Indians in America. So that said, I think we need to formally educate, as you said. I congratulate that work by half for formally educating. I have a problem though. A lot of times when we are advising how to integrate, we kind of work in silos. Take, for example, Christmas. Every Hindu has a Christmas tree with a star on top there. I said, okay, well, put a lighted diya. Let's go with the tree. The kids love it. But put a diya on top. Integrate and also keep your identity in there. Who advises our population? You can get it from the Pope. Granted, we are not like that. I miss Swami Dayananda Saraswati. I miss him. He was that kind of voice. And you say what you want. We Hindus want that kind of voice. We want the religious person, not the scholar. And you know what I mean? You need that coming from the guru and the Swami and so on. What's your advice on that? How can we go there?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it is difficult to herd Hindus together. But first, let me kind of reaffirm what Conrad said about Articles 25 through 30, and much of the changes that we can see outside India has to originate in India. And I don't know why the Articles 25 through 30 initiative is been been put aside. There are some things that can re-energize and reshape discussions in ways that we can't imagine. And therefore, with that said, and Indraniji, you're right. In terms of the Hindu presence, the Hindu diaspora, and this is where I think this evening's talk in the Hindu Students' Council, they in fact explore those aspects too, and sometimes the divide. And this is something, as I have mentioned, we keep to our own groups. Oh, I'm a Kannada Kuta person. I don't go to the temple because it's full of whatever, it's managed by Tamilians, or there are these quarrels, and it's a reflection of the quarrels back home. These are not new quarrels. These are quarrels originating at home. And in some ways, and Conrad's fear that basically it's not just the outside forces chipping away at this Hindu identity, but it is the Hindu identity itself, which the way we have right now in the modern era presenting it is also built on a kind of shifting sands. So we got to acknowledge that. But I think, again, the Articles 25 through 30 could be a game changer. Because then, yes, with all of our differences, with all of our, whether, for example, in my family, just in terms of whether going to the temple or following a guru, there are differences. There are differences within communities, across regions. There are more of the gurus and up in the north than in the south. There are all kinds of regional linguistic differences. Those things can be easily managed. But I think the essential kind of identity that can be reshaped, that can be provided a firmer ground if the Indian government, if the Indian legislators can work on I mean, my goodness, the Indian Constitution is not like the US Constitution where amendments are rare. we have had 10 amendments each year kind of stuff. So I mean, these are it is a question of leadership here, the sagacity and the kind of foresight that says and therefore we need some person who has got the ears of Narendra Modi or Amit Shah or whoever in that kind of circle to say, this is important, and for these reasons. Hey, put together a little executive summary. Maybe Conrad and I can work on that. But actually, Conrad has, because an article that we published in India Facts just a couple of months ago on Hindu rights, and he says the time is now, and he articulates the position as to why this Articles 25 through 30 change is important.